I had been chatting with this girl online for weeks, and she seemed like the perfect match for me. So when she suggested we meet at hers, which happened to be in the middle of nowhere, I couldn't resist the adventure. My GPS had guided me through the labyrinth of back roads with the promise that I was nearing her location. But as I rounded yet another bend, I found myself in the middle of a seemingly abandoned junkyard. Rusty old cars and worn-down buildings loomed in the darkness. The place was only lit by my car and the moonlight. Confusion turned to fear as I realized this was the wrong place. Panic set in when the harsh glare of headlights suddenly appeared behind me. A group of burly men, their faces obscured by the shadows, blocked my way and surrounded my truck. One of them, clearly the leader, approached my window. His eyes were filled with suspicion. "What the hell are you doing here, boy? This is private property." My words tumbled out in a rush as I explained my predicament, that I was supposed to meet someone nearby, but my GPS had led me astray. They exchanged glances, their suspicion turning into a sinister grin. Sure, the leader said, "but you see, we've been having some trouble with trespassers lately. Can't be too careful, you know?" His companions chuckled ominously. Without another word, I threw my car into reverse and backed out of there as fast as I could. My heart was pounding. I turned the car around quicker than I thought was possible, and I fumbled with the GPS, trying to tell it to return home. The men continued to shout at me as I sped away, but my troubles were far from over. My GPS, unable to keep up with my rapid escape, soon led me onto an even narrower road. Darkness surrounded me as I ventured further into the woods. My anxiety was making my legs shake aggressively, and my hands could barely follow simple instructions. With no cell service and no signs of civilization, I was well and truly lost. Suddenly, as if mocking my desperation, a deer bounded out from the shadows and onto the road. Panic surged through me as I slammed on the brakes, screeching almost to a complete stop. The deer barely reacted and just continued to slowly prance down the road. Suddenly, I noticed the rednecks from the junkyard had caught up, their truck now dangerously close behind me. They were leaning on the horn, yelling obscenities, and I really started to feel like I wasn't getting out of this alive. Desperation pushed me to follow the deer. I drove at a crawl, praying the animal would move aside. But it just dominated the road in front of me for a painful amount of time. It continued to run ahead of me. The longer it was there, the more it started to look like some type of demon. It looked like something you'd see in Norse mythology. Its horns looked like human arms reaching into the sky. My heart raced as I watched the creature's every move. The rednecks were relentless, inching closer, their voices growing louder, getting even angrier. The suspense was unbearable. I was trapped behind the deer, with nowhere to go, and a group of hostile men closing in behind me. The narrow road seemed to stretch on forever, and with every passing second I couldn't help imagine all of the different ways that I was going to be killed. The men in the truck behind me were starting to push into the back of my car, and I could hear the revving of their engine, eager to push me off the road. I really started to panic and started honking at the deer. I even contemplated abandoning my car and fleeing into the darkness, but I knew that would be futile. They would catch me within moments. As we continued our awful drive on that terrible road, the deer suddenly leaped to the side, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I seized the opportunity and accelerated. When I looked back in my mirror, I saw the deer jump out again right in front of their truck. They slammed on the brakes and were frantically shouting at it to get out of the way. I'm sure they had no issue with killing a deer, but ramming it with their truck at that slow speed would likely just make it angry, and it wouldn't be worth the damage. I didn't hesitate for a second as I went full speed down the rest of the road, hitting every bump with no regard for the condition of my car. I drove for what felt like hours, my heart still pounding, until I finally stumbled upon a small town. There, I found my bearings and eventually made it to the nearest motel. It was only when I locked the door behind me that I felt safe enough to breathe. As I lay in bed, trying to process what had happened, I couldn't help wondering about that deer. Was it merely a coincidence, a strange twist of fate? Or did it know what it was doing, sensing my fear, deciding to lead me away from danger and preventing them from chasing me. I'd almost completely forgotten about my date, and when I checked the app to tell her what had happened, she'd unmatched. I have mixed thoughts about the whole thing. Was she a catfish the whole time, luring me into danger? Did she think that I had ghosted her, so she unmatched out of embarrassment? I kind of believe that she set me up, either as a prank or as part of the junkyard group. If you're enjoying the video, please show your support. Let's try to get 50 likes. I was 13 when this happened to me. I stayed at my friend's house almost every weekend. She had a huge bedroom and I just lived with my mom in a small apartment, so whenever I stayed there it felt like I had a taste of what a real family home felt like. That would be true if it wasn't for the constant arguing that I hear from her parents. Her dad was always really nice to me, pretty much treating me like his own daughter. He'd buy us food and DVDs and make sure that we had the best sleepovers every week. Her mom, on the other hand, was always quite cold with me. She wouldn't really even speak to me. Most of the arguments that I could hear were her shouting at him. Looking back, I realized that she was emotionally manipulating him, claiming he didn't love her and accusing him of being sleazy. But at the time, I just thought this was what parents would do every night. Anyway, we would mostly just turn up the TV and distract ourselves from the shouting, and usually we'd have a really good night. This night was different. Her dad basically rushed us up to her room and we could tell he was stressed. I tried asking my friend about her parents, but she just deflected and said she didn't want to talk about it. We did our makeup and hair and tried on different outfits throughout the night, and within a few hours we were almost falling asleep whilst watching the first Twilight film. Suddenly we could hear her parents arguing really loudly. There were bangs and the sounds of things smashing. This wasn't normal. I could hear her mom practically screaming at her dad, throwing the usual accusations and seemingly hitting him. I know this because he was shouting stop. At some point he started to make his way upstairs and I hear him slam the door to their bedroom just next to the room we were staying in. It wasn't long until her mom made her way upstairs and burst into their room. I heard him shouting, "What the hell?" And then lots of screaming and shouting. The whole house was practically shaking as they were throwing each other around their room and knocking into the wall. I felt really uncomfortable at this point and asked if we could lock the door. My friend agreed and reminded me to be quiet. Just as I clicked the lock, the screams and shouting went silent. My friend and I stared at each other, waiting until we heard one of them go downstairs or to make any kind of noise. Nothing. We waited for minutes, listening at the door and speculating what was happening. Had they just gone to sleep after all that shouting? Unlikely. Suddenly, I hear footsteps and rush back to bed. There's a gentle knock on the door. "Honey, are you awake?" Her mom was coming to check on us. She literally never did this. Before my friend could respond, her mom tried to open the door. She realized it was locked and then immediately started shouting loudly, "Open the door! Now!" I looked at my friend with begging eyes and told her not to open it. Her mom started pleading with us through the door, kicking it loudly, sending massive shocks throughout the room. Her mom turned her attention at me and started ordering me to open the door, gradually getting more nasty, telling me I was a leech and that I would end up like my mother, alone and miserable. I started crying and so did my friend. At this point I called my mom and told her what was happening. She could hear the door being kicked and the nasty comments, and she told us to put something in front of the door. She told me she had to hang up for a moment whilst she called the police, and we were both left there waiting for this terrifying moment to be over. The banging stopped and I could hear her mom's footsteps going down the hallway. The footsteps came back towards us and then things got seriously disturbing. The end of a knife burst through the door. It was shiny and long, and she repeatedly stabbed the door, gradually chipping away at the cheap wood. We were obviously screaming uncontrollably at this point, and I have a vivid memory of exactly when I noticed something terrible. As the knife came through the door, I noticed that the white paint around the hole started to turn red. It looked like the door was bleeding. My first thought was that she'd hurt herself whilst on her rampage, but my friend's screams suddenly made me realize exactly what had happened. She started screaming for her dad. It hadn't even crossed my mind. She'd only walked a few steps to go and collect this knife. Why would she have a knife in her bedroom, and why would it be covered in blood? Up until this point, I thought we were just going to be in trouble with her psychotic mom. Maybe she would take away our snacks and make us go to bed, or send me home. I was pretty naive, but it just didn't cross my mind that she was going to kill us. The door was slowly coming apart and she was just grunting loudly every time she'd stab the door. She was evidently getting tired, but she wasn't giving up. My friend was still screaming for her dad and I was a complete mess, crying and pleading for her mom to stop. She started trying to reach her hand through one of the cracks she'd made, but she couldn't reach the lock. At this point, when she'd reached for the lock through the smashed door, she was ripping her skin along her forearm, desperately trying to get in. Her arm was flailing around through the hole. We both cuddled up in the corner of the room, exhausted from all the crying. She was going to get through, and there was nothing us small girls could do to stop her. We both hear something that makes us stop sobbing, and we look directly into each other's eyes. Police sirens. The cops were here and we were going to be saved. Her mom clearly heard them as well, because she started going feral on this door. She was screaming and smashing at it with both hands, occasionally stabbing wildly at the hole she'd made. We'd thrown a small bedside table and a chair next to the door, which lined up perfectly with her wardrobe, creating a line of furniture that perfectly blocked the door from opening, even if it was unlocked. The cops started banging on the front door and she made the choice to violently shove her arm through the hole, ripping open her arm. I watched as she pushed through the pane, finally reaching the door lock. She'd done it. She was nearly inside. She opened the door a few inches before a barricade stopped her from pushing it any further. Her hand once again reached through and started clawing at the bedside table we put there. She was gradually moving it and it was clear she was making progress. She pushed through enough that her shoulder was now in the room and her arm was slowly shifting the table to the side. All while this is happening, the police are smashing the front door, reacting to our terrified screams. All at once, we hear the door downstairs give way, the cops shouting for us, their footsteps running up the stairs. Her mom must have used all her energy to force the door open and lunged straight towards us. We were crouched in the corner, unable to quickly react. She landed on my friend and gripped her neck with ferocity. I remember how fast she turned purple. She was still holding my hand and struggling wildly, trying to get free whilst her own mother was choking the life out of her. The cops burst into the room, immediately tackling her to the ground. There was so much screaming and shouting and flashlights, and I think they even used a taser. It was overwhelming. My friend lay next to me, barely breathing and having a seizure. They ran to her aid and one female cop kept checking me and asking me if I was okay, scanning me for injuries and trying to get a response from me. I think I just froze at this point because I don't remember much of what happened after. I know we went to hospital for a while and I remember them putting a shiny blanket on me, which made no sense to me at the time. Throughout the night we learned that her dad had been stabbed to death. I think he had over 80 stab wounds, all over his body. Her mom was sent to a psych ward and remains there today, over 10 years later. I never saw my friend again after that night. She was sent away to live with her grandparents. It completely messed me up for years. I was a dark and troubled teenager. Even now I have terrible anxiety around staying at other people's houses. I used to dream about having both parents living at home together, but I realize now that my home life was much better than what my friend had. About 10 years ago, I lived on my own and didn't have much company. I was quite depressed at the time after losing my girlfriend to a drunk driver. I was enjoying a beer and watching the sunset on the back porch when I saw a large, scruffy man emerging from the tree line. My heart skipped a beat as he stumbled towards my house in a menacing way. Living alone, I often used my backyard for target practice. And at that moment, I was immensely grateful for it. Instinctively, I rushed to bolt all the doors while frantically dialing the police. What I didn't know was that this intruder had broken in the day before through a basement window and had spent the night squatting there. He had left the basement door unlocked, and at this point, he made his way inside the house and was making his way up the stairs towards me. I gripped my rifle, aiming it at the approaching man as he descended the hallway. I shouted at him, ordering him to stop and get on the ground, but he just kept walking towards me. I fired the first round, loaded with rock salt, but he showed no reaction, undeterred. I quickly followed with a rubber bullet to the chest. Yet the drugged-up guy, who was clearly out of his mind, continued advancing. This guy was huge, at least twice my size, and I realized that whatever drugs he had in his body were going to push him through any pain that a rubber bullet would inflict. He was backing me into a corner. I desperately begged him to stop and warned him what would happen, but he just moaned at me like a zombie and lunged towards me. I took my third shot. I can't recall whether it was buckshot or a slug, but it left a gaping hole in his chest. It barely even slowed him down. He kept coming, and in a frenzied struggle, he wrestled me to the ground. He was moaning and coughing up blood. Suddenly, he grabbed my face with both of his massive hands and started squeezing my head. It was utterly terrifying. I could feel him trying to burst my skull open like a balloon. I don't know how long it actually lasted, but it felt like forever. Eventually, the injury finally caught up with him, and he died on top of me. I was laying with him crushing me for a few minutes. My energy was completely drained, and I could barely breathe with his weight on top of me. His body was pushing my rifle into my chest, and it was causing me serious pain when I tilted his body to the side. I was completely drenched in his blood, and I can still remember the overwhelming smell. I'd completely forgotten that I was still on the phone with the operator, who had heard our entire exchange, which more or less amounted to me pleading, "Stop, or I'll shoot," and the man menacingly taunting. The police arrived soon after, and the incident made it to the local papers. There was a criminal investigation, but eventually, I was cleared of any wrongdoing. It turned out that the intruder was wanted for murder of an elderly couple in Baltimore and had somehow made his way 50 miles up the road into a rural area.